Good evening. Welcome to the May 16th, 2023 City of Everett Planning Commission meeting. Kathy, would you please take the roll?
Chair Chatters,
Here.
Commissioner Atkins,
Here.
Commissioner Finch,
Here.
Commissioner Yanusak,
Here.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Here.
Commissioner McGinn,
Here.
Commissioner Sullivan,
Here.
Commissioner Lark.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Atkins, would you read the land acknowledgement, please?
Gladly. We acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land, the Shtahopes people and their successors, the Tulalip tribes. Since time immemorial, they have hunted, fished, gathered on, and taken care of these lands and waters. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. We will strive to be honest about our past mistakes and bring about a future that includes their people, stories, voices, to form a more just and equitable society.
Thank you. Do I hear a motion for approval of the April 18th minutes?
So moved.
Second?
Thank you. Kathy, would you do the honors?
Commissioner Lark,
Yes.
Commissioner Sullivan,
Yes.
Commissioner McGinn,
Abstain.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes.
Commissioner Yanusak,
Yes.
Commissioner Finch,
Yes.
Commissioner Atkins,
Yes.
Chair Chatters.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now on to reports and comments, but before we begin that, we have a very important issue to raise, which is that this is the final meeting for Commissioner Carly McGinn. Commissioner McGinn, I just want to say that it has been really an honor to work with you. I've found the contributions you've made to the conversations really valuable. So I want to thank you for your time that you've spent with the commission. And I'm sure that our staff and other commissioners would love to express some gratitude for your service to the community as well. So I invite you all to do that.
Yeah, would you like me to go first, or? Great. Well, we've got a letter and a certificate of appreciation for you that I will hand over, but I thought I'd read the letter first because rather than speaking extemporaneously. Just wanted to give Commissioner McGinn a hearty thank you for 5 years of service on Everett's Planning Commission. Your knowledge, experience, and balanced input have been an asset to the Commission's work. Your care for the city, its residents, its history, and its future are evident. Serving on the Planning Commission means a lot of work, especially with long agendas like today's. A lot of time and a lot of hard thinking. On the behalf of the Planning Department, Mayor Franklin, and the City Administration and the City Council, thank you for your invaluable service and dedication to the Commission and to the people of Everett. And just to add to that, thank you. You've been a great presence and a good attitude for the couple of years that I've been around as staff to this commission. And we will miss your insight and your thoughts and your knowledge, particularly around the area of design and architecture. And there's a whole host of knowledge that I think we will miss. I think I told you when I first heard about this that our ask of you is to try to connect us to another architect or someone in the design profession, because I think that's an important part of balance on this commission. But congratulations on the new endeavors, and we're sorry to see you go, but we heartily thank you for the work that you've done here.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I'd just like to add my expressions of appreciation to Commissioner McGinn. I've always respected her attention to detail in our discussions, and also your sunny attitude.
Oh,
A sunny attitude is not always easy in our positions, but you've maintained it very well. So thank you very much.
I would add to that a balanced disposition. I think that your comments have always been very balanced and fair and very thoughtful. So thank you for your contributions.
I just want to say thank you for all the conversations about housing we've had over the years and being able to share adorable photos of my kids with you. That's been also a highlight.
I hope that doesn't stop.
It might, no, I'm kidding.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and I'm sorry to go early.
Thank you. And with that, we'll move on to commissioner reports. None? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Atkins, please.
This past month, I had the great wonder of being able to attend the first in-person meeting of the Governor's State Advisory Council on Homelessness. As the youth representative on that board, over the past couple of years, we've just been meeting virtually. But we met for the first time in person in a number of years down in SeaTac and had a wonderful presentation from the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development regarding a national homelessness strategy. And just think that there's a lot of work happening that we don't necessarily know about at the federal level that I hope that we all can learn more from in the future.
Thank you. With that, we'll move on to staff comments.
Thank you, Chair. Long agenda today, so I'll be brief here, give you an update on the Housing Development Incentive Program ordinances. These were the implementation of the Housing Action Plan for residential development incentives. The System Development Charges and Park Impact Fee Waiver ordinances passed on May the 3rd through the City Council. And then at that meeting, based on public comment, the council wanted to think more about the minimum eligibility of 16 dwelling units for eligibility for the limited property tax exemption. You may remember discussing that point in your deliberations as well. They tabled the multifamily tax exemption ordinance to the following week, and an amendment was proposed at that meeting to reduce it back to 8. Which is what is the existing minimum in code. That amendment was not successful, and subsequently the ordinance passed as was recommended by the Planning Commission, along with one staff proposed amendment that we inserted into the process that required a deeper affordability for extensions of the exemption. So if you've gone through an 8 or a 12-year exemption period, the new law from the state allows for an extension for another 12 years. The ordinance that or the recommendation that came out of the Planning Commission, which was what the staff had initially recommended, required the same affordability level as the original extension, but when we were looking a little bit closer at it, it seemed that the value of the extension exceeded significantly to the property owner the value of the original one, because there's a certain amount that is kind of an incentive for building the building, 8 years worth just for building it, and then 4 years of exemption for the affordability, and then you would get 12 more years just for the affordability. So we proposed, and the council accepted an amendment that dropped the affordability threshold to 50% area median income for any extensions. That was the only change to what came out of the Planning Commission for the 3 ordinances. So now on to codification and implementation. We hope that closing the file on the housing development incentives work will give us a little bit of capacity to pick up the accessory dwelling units ordinance. As you'll hear later on in the agenda today, the state legislature did adopt a bill indeed that affected accessory dwelling units. I think we talked a little bit about this last month too. So we'll need to review that ordinance that is poised for city council consideration for reconciliation with the state bill, but 90+% of it is aligned with the requirement in state law. So we were actually just early to the game there. And then last note, we are in the period, maybe halfway through the specific amendment request period. So this is a opportunity for members of the public or anyone really to suggest a specific amendment to the comprehensive plan, development regulation, zoning map, building height map, street designation, text, images, anything that is under consideration for the periodic update. Sometimes these types of processes are known as a docket process. The period for accepting applications runs until, I believe, noon on June 12th. That's a Monday. And This process is somewhat parallel to the public comment and engagement that we seek throughout the entire public periodic update process. But as called for in state law, this provides a very defined process and kind of a guarantee of placement of a specific amendment request before the Planning Commission and the City Council, whereas other public comment is incorporated into the process as well, but maybe not in as defined or clear of a way. So there are some specific parameters around how an application must be made for these specific amendments. When we've had a couple of inquiries and a couple of applications come in already. When the window closes, staff will review the applications, and there's a requirement for some analysis and an environmental checklist and some supporting documentation to accompany it. After reviewing all of that, staff will bring a recommendation to the Planning Commission on which of those amendments move forward into the update process. The City Council will then have their turn to confirm or change that recommendation on which amendments come in. And then the ones that make it through that process will be incorporated into our environmental review process in the two action alternatives, the alternatives 2 and 3. And at that point, they would be kind of eligible for inclusion into the preferred alternative and into the comprehensive plan and development regulations that are ultimately adopted. None of this to take away from the value of public participation and comment letters. Anybody out there who does not take part in this process is welcome to do the exact same thing through the public comment process. The only thing that would be missing is that guaranteed kind of exposure to the Planning Commission within this defined framework. This will be the only period during the periodic update for these types of specific amendments. And then after the periodic update, we'll pick up with our regular annual docket process for annual amendments to the plan. Happy to take any questions on those or anything else. Okay. Otherwise, our next item, I'm going to vacate my seat for a moment because we've got a whole crew here with the Housing Authority, and I won't even try to make introductions. But
Well, before we move on to
Oh, yes.
the next agenda item, we do have an opportunity for public comment. So to those of you joining us remotely, please mute your microphone, or if you are calling in, mute your phone by pressing *6. At each opportunity for public comment, I will ask if anyone wants to speak. If you are participating remotely and would like to provide comment, unmute your microphone or press *6 on your phone, and then when you are done, please mute it again. Do we have anyone in person who would like to offer public comment? Kathy, do we have anyone online? No. Okay, thank you. All right, we're ready to move on to next agenda item, and I know we're all excited for this one.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's lovely to see all of you again. We very much appreciate the opportunity today to come back to you following our January discussion, as well as a field walk that followed in regards to the Baker Heights property and what we are now calling the Park District. My name is Jason Morrow. I'm the Director of Development for the Everett Housing Authority. And I'm just here very quickly to provide a few comments and then very quickly turn over to introduce the rest of our program tonight. Leslie Bain with Framework, who's our lead urban planner, will be providing a large chunk of the presentation tonight. Followed up by that will be Ted Panton of GGLO. He'll be working through a lot of the vertical architecture of the apartment buildings. And then Bob Bankford of Makers Architecture in the back will come out and discuss kind of next steps in entitlement. First and foremost, we want to thank all of you for your service. We appreciate the amount of time and effort you all put in. Some of us who've also been in similar roles understand the contribution to the city and how much time and effort it really does take to think through these issues and come out every evening both thoughtful and incisive. So we appreciate your service. The Housing Authority has, if you can move to the next slide, please. The Housing Authority has owned this land since 1942, 1943. And we've been in the neighborhood for around 80 years. We intend to be in the neighborhood for another 80 years. And the problem set that we're here to solve tonight, as well as prior discussions and the thing we've been working through for a year and a half through master planning and then to this stage, is following relocation of residents in obsolescent housing, what do we do next with this large parcel of land? And we have 15 acres of land. Roughly 2.5 to 3 acres of it right now is being redeveloped. We're very close to the completion of 105 units called Madrona Square. 67 units of those are for homeless families with children in the Everett School District, the remaining for families below 60% AMI. With their retaining parcels, we're left with the big question of how do we meet the needs in the community? How do we engage social connection across the community? And how can the Housing Authority and our position as a municipal entity, both in charge with providing housing for low and moderate income families, but also in a position of large land resources and also development capacity to execute, how do we contribute most? And what you're about to see tonight is the evolution of the work that this design team here, but also basically a 14-firm contribution has evolved in the last 4 or 5 months. We're hopeful that it's additional information that you've been seeking, and we look forward to having a dialogue following the presentation. So thank you very much for your time. We look forward to giving you the presentation.
Okay, I think this is on. Is that on? Great. Thank you. Yeah, we're really excited to be here. We've been working hard on the design and just wanted to touch base before we unroll that on the pillars behind what's driving the design. So the needs and opportunity. And there's really 3 of them: housing, equity and community building, and decarbonization. Housing, as just the discussion that came before, is a hot topic in Washington State. Growth in housing is just such a huge issue, and specifically here in Everett. Snohomish County numbers, the most recent numbers, say that by 2044, you need over 37,000 housing units. And that's in a city that currently has 47,000 housing units. So it's kind of overwhelming. The green there, the 1,500 new homes in the Park District, is a drop in the bucket in a way, but it's an important piece of that solution. And so we're hoping with this project to put forward some new models where housing can be done in a way that builds community and brings assets to neighborhoods. So this is a really unique opportunity. 15 acres is hard to come by. This is in an area that is near some amenities and opportunities like the hospital and the Wazoo and Everett Community College. It's got housing around it that largely is owned by EHA. Baker Heights, which is a 7 or 8 story building. Madrona Square is coming up out of the ground, that's 4 stories. Wiggums Park Place is across 12th. It's also got the Boys and Girls Club, the elementary school. So there's a lot going on here that can support new housing in the neighborhood and make it a community. The second one is equity. Again, this is a goal of the City of Everett, the Mayor's 2021 Everett Initiative. This is a graphic from that, but it's something that the city is taking seriously and something that we take seriously as well. The idea is to provide communities of opportunity where we can bring people into a neighborhood where there are lots of opportunities and fill in the gaps. So in a walkable area, you can get to educational opportunities, you can get to employment opportunities, you can get to medical care, and transit is there and will be improving over time. So we think this is a really amazing opportunity and want to take the best advantage of it that we can. The equity and community building, we want this to be part of the Delta neighborhood. We want this to fill in the things that we've heard from the community are gaps. They want a coffee shop, they want a place to hang out, they want ice cream for their kids. And we've been working with some partners that would love to be here. KSER, if you guys have been to, in Seattle, the KEXP at Seattle Center is a wonderful example of community space where you can have concerts and coffee. Childcare is a real need in the neighborhood, talking to both childcare for young ones and early education. Everett Library would love to be here if we can get some resources for them. And neighborhood business owners, they would love to see a market. They'd love to see, a bunch of walkable things to make this the kind of place that you don't have to, drive your car everywhere. Decarbonization is another place where the City of Everett has some really amazing and commendable goals. Reducing greenhouse gases by half in 2030 is a big lift. We want to see what we can do to help accomplish that. So this is a little graphic from that plan. You don't have to read everything, but we can have at least some impact on almost all of them. And the one with the blue arrow, just want to point to, is the strategy for the first land use is support intentional high-density development. So this is the kind of thing that we want to do, walkable, bikeable. We hope to use some mass timber construction and get that industry going in the region. Everybody loves the community gardens. We want to expand those. We talked to the neighborhood the other night about expanding the tree canopy. So a lot of things that we can do to help in that effort. So with that as the basis for how we design this, I'm going to pass this over to Ted to take you through the design. This is what our ambition is. As you know, we're going to go through a PDO process. So this is what we're looking at. These are our ideas of how to best treat this site, and off you go.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. So I'm just going to go back one. Just in terms of high level, we're really going to, it looks like there's a little lag time. Unless it's automatic right now or something. Okay, there we go. We're going to talk a little bit about the neighborhood. Obviously, the team has set that up really well. When I came on board, there's a lot of great contextual analysis and outreach that was mentioned. We're going to talk about the program, also drill into those elements that Leslie outlined, and then talk about open space, which is just really a core part of the design. As Jason mentioned, we have a pretty big team, and a lot of that is through necessity, but it also gives us a lot of great internal resources that I think we've all really benefited from. It's been just really a great experience overall, just speaking for myself, and I think it's just really neat to see it come along to the point where it is now. I'm not going to list all these out, but there you see us there, all of our logos, and some samples of our work that most of us have been involved over the years with dense urban infill development and all that comes with it. So also just drilling into our agenda, we did, as I mentioned, want to talk about the context and the connections and the program. That includes retail uses, but also community serving civic uses, as Jason mentioned. And then the network of open space, which includes a significant park in the center of our plan, buffering and sort of transitions around the edges. And we're also going to talk about height relative to open space, because that was a real key to the development of our plan, was really how all these pieces mesh together and create a really great dense urban infill neighborhood. So here is our plan. I don't have a pointer or anything, so I'll have to just describe this. You can see the one quick thing to note is that north is to your right, and so west would be up on this page. And so the length of our site is sort of positioned on the slide here. Madrona Square, the existing phase 1, is under construction right now, as Jason mentioned. We have what we're calling sort of a green edge, which we'll get into a little bit. And then off to the north there is Wiggums, which you, what, is it right click?
No,
Oh, maybe okay, just cursor. Okay, thanks for the heads up on that. I'm getting a little used to this button though, so I think I'll stick with the button. Getting used to the action on that. Anyway, that's kind of our big, as I mentioned, the park, you can see, is at the center and core of this. That's just really, from a designer's standpoint, it was just really great to have as this incredible frontage. And what we've done here is really taken the street network and created into these sub-districts. There's really 4 of these, which we'll get into as we go forward. We did want to talk about the connection to the wetland, and I just highlighted that to the area above. And we really think the relationship of these, the wetland, which has its own qualities of character, the sort of deep green context, sort of contrasted with the more formal sort of qualities of the park that we're creating will have just a really interesting adjacency. And so that's one thing that we're really looking forward to evolving. Safe routes to school was another sort of context element we wanted to talk about with the elementary school nearby. You can see that maybe a little hard to make out in this screen, but the orange arrow there kind of gives you sort of the indication of how kids might make their way to school, at least from this frontage here to the south of the school. Let's see, actually, yeah, I could use the cursor, I guess, too. You could see Hawthorne Elementary there. Anyway, the takeaway there is it's sort of an engaging, walkable street frontage, as well as the green edge that's being created. So that's something we're also looking forward to evolving. One of the bigger pieces is really how retail comes along. We had sort of on 12th Street here, and a real sort of gateway experience that you see highlighted there, and I'll just kind of use the cursor to show there. It's a little hard to make out. And as you make your way south into the project, and as you come into the park, there's actually a really great sort of a retail hub that includes these civic functions that really makes the heart of the project, we feel like. And that also connects back by Cross Street back up to Poplar. So this vignette here, just to give you some flavor of scale and sort of language that we've been working with. Leslie calls these the sort of the cat's paws here at the entrance that really create this little gateway, if you will, that includes the library on the left-hand side and what we would hope to be a market on the right-hand side of the street, or the west side of the street. So that gives you sort of a sense of the scale. And its intent here is to make this as inviting and sort of attractive for just walkability and just connecting into the development. And lastly, in terms of connections, there is currently Wiggums Hollow Park. We also feel like First Street creates a really great opportunity there to create a walkable new infrastructure piece that will connect up to that to the north. So in terms of the program, we just wanted to talk about this for a moment. Like that, it's been a long time. I've been working on these projects for over 20 years, like similar typology, if you will. And I've never seen a library included in a mixed-use project. I mean, it does happen, but then if you added a radio station on top of that, I think you just have this really cool vibe as far as like some foundational uses. I think that's always a question with mixed-use development, that empty first floor that they had to do, and it was retail that didn't work out. And so there's just having that sort of enliven and create a core for the project, I think, is just an amazing opportunity. So sort of getting back to the plan, that retail core, I'm just going to kind of locate this for you and talk about some of the adjacencies. The retail uses are obviously going to be sort of set up in that area. The library, early education, shown sort of graphically as blue here, will sort of also commingle or synergize with that. And we feel like, relative to the elementary school, relative to Wiggums Hollow, and relative to our own park space, that's just really dynamic core especially for what's going to be an early phase in the project. So anyway, if we zoom in here to the plan a little bit, we'll map it out. Retail really goes on either side of the street along with the library. And so you can imagine these getting knitted together to sort of cross-street neighbors that will go across the street there to really create sort of a nice walkable frontage. And really back on First Street, we have all our early childhood program, and then KSER is really located up by the retail and adjacent to the park as well. So this view sort of looking to the north gives you a sense of what that would look like, and I'll just kind of locate the radio station first with the cursor. They're really kind of holding the first floor on this right-hand or eastern building, and then this would be a food and beverage, or on either side of that would sort of breathe life into this open space that includes the street frontage. Is really a really great mix of linear open spaces and sort of more sort of casual yard type spaces that we'll get into in a little bit. But at any rate, the goal here was really to create some fine grain sense of scale, but also have these buildings be very honest about what they are in terms of their size. talking about open space, we had really that green buffer that we mentioned that would feature sort of a meandering walking path as well as community gardens. The major open space, we've been sort of kicking around names. Leslie mentioned Poplar Park earlier, so we'll just kind of throw that out there if there's any sort of thoughts about that. But you can see there's sort of an upper tier and a lower tier. I think for those that are familiar with the site, there's a pretty steep drop, and I should have mentioned that at the outset. Really, you're going over 40 vertical feet from the west end of the site to the east end. So the park itself will follow that grade, and the buildings will also terrace as they go down the hillside, and we feel like that is sort of an identifier and really a language that we really hope to play up. What you saw before at the retail area was sort of a flatter plateau, but as we get into the nature of the park, you'll see that it has really this sort of very terraced quality to it. And then lastly, there is the green buffer to our east along First Street. And so those sort of bracketed buffers along with that major open space, we feel like makes a great hierarchy for this. Here is the view of Poplar Park, or to be named park. And you get sort of a sense we're at the top of the hill, or if you will, like we're at Poplar looking down. And this is sort of a hard to make out, but there is obviously going to be views of the Cascades that are just going to be really amazing through the aperture of this open space. And we wanted the language of the buildings to follow that and really create both the opening and the aperture, but also create their own identities as they kind of step along the hillside. You can see in the foreground here, the building that's up on Poplar is going to be a bit taller than the next building down that's more fronting on Hemlock. So there's some steps in the building that you can make out there. And then as you get even further down, your grade is going to drop even more. We do, as I mentioned, sort of tabled out the park for this sort of uses that are envisioned there, which could include concerts and things of that nature to make it sort of more of an urban sort of focus. But in the upper reach of the park, you can see here there's a lot of stepping and terracing. So in terms of program for the park, we've talked about a few things. We're not completely set on all these, but certainly as a major gathering space with a great lawn. There are going to be community gardens that are sort of an adjunct to it, as well as play areas. And then, of course, the retail and civic core, which includes a radio station and some really great retail uses. We feel like they'll just be really great. It's easy to imagine, I think, on an evening like tonight, spending, dropping by after work, or just it being a great resource for the community. And I can imagine the views and such would just be an amazing place to watch the sky, thunderstorms, whatever. Just getting through this, I wanted to also mention when we programmed the open spaces and how they would relate to the building pads, we also gave a long consideration and thought to how we would orient the taller elements in our program. And we call these sort of euphemistically towers, but they're really 12-story buildings, which in some cases you would be defined as a tower, but you'll see that the scale of those, we're really trying to get sort of incremental with the other mid-rise components that we have integrated into the plan. But I just want to kind of highlight in these orange squares, this is where we have come to sort of a conclusion as to where we would want to put these higher program elements. And a big part of that is the natural buffering that happens around them. These red boxes sort of show you the open spaces that we were able to control with our plan. And we felt like having those really be sort of the major transition between the taller building elements and the neighboring context was a really core part of the solution. So, and that's something that the team, we had a lot of spicy deliberations internally, and I think what we ended up with is a pretty good place. But we look forward to your comments as well. I was going to mention also that there is, there it is, the last element here, Baker View, already fairly tall building that is to our direct south, and so clustering our buildings kind of along an axis with that and sort of having that create a sort of almost wedding cake type language we felt like was a really good solution. So as we go to what we're showing you here, this is all under development, so take it with a grain of salt. But you can sort of see as we're looking in this bird's eye perspective from the northeast looking to the southwest, you get kind of a sense of the, obviously the Everett is blessed with being next to Puget Sound and seeing the Olympics off to the west. bit more to our immediate context, we also have the wetland adjacent to us to the west, as well as the major open space of our park. And you can see just sort of how the hillside impacts us as far as how we're situating buildings. They are terracing and stepping as they go down to the east. And then the towers, we really wanted to weave those in, as I mentioned, and not have them be these sort of monolithic expressions, but have them really taper into the areas around them. And so that's kind of the language that you see here. And capture views, yeah, thanks, Leslie. The other thing is, you're gonna get amazing views. I think that's just like so evident when you're in Everett and you're looking down the hill to the east. But as you go to the upper stories of any of these, I think even the mid-rise will have some really interesting westerly views that will just be really wonderful. So with that, I'm gonna hand it back to Leslie to talk about the community benefits.
Yeah, so as part of this, thanks. This is requiring a PDO, as you all know, and we understand that the density comes with community benefits. So I'm not going to read all of these, but we really are working hard to try and work with the community to find out what they most want and need and how we can provide it on the site in a way that makes the kind of new model for a neighborhood that we need in this region. So thank you. I'm going to ask Bob to come talk about next steps and schedule.
One of these. There we go.
Ready?
Okay, why don't we go to the next slide?
Got that one?
Yes, let's just go to this. So there's 4 different entitlement approvals that we're going to be needing, obviously including the plan development overlay being the big one. And that goes, of course, through it goes through the planning commission for recommendation and city council approval. The other 3 are the development agreement, which we're obviously going to need. That requires city council approval. The environmental impact statement, which is going on right now. Staff is the decision maker on that. And a street vacation. We're going to be vacating portions of streets and adding new streets. And so we're working with staff right now on some of the intricate details of that. And that's going to require city council approval. So, and as far as the rest of the schedule here, I believe I had to look back at when our last meeting was, but I think it was in October when we met with you last time. So that was in the...
January.
Was it in January? I think we had changed it, but in any case, that was in the blue portion of the draft development plan. Shortly after we held the community meeting, we are in the middle of the entitlements document and drafting the submittal. And right after this, next week, we're holding another public meeting, which will be the 5th. And that includes the 3 that occurred in 2021 as part of the master plan process before we got involved. And then we're going to be meeting with council, I believe the 31st or the 30th of May. And we're also really busy pulling together a packet for the pre-application meeting with staff, which we're trying to pull together in the next week or 2 and trying to get a meeting for June. So using any input from you, the community, city council, and from staff from the pre-application, the idea here is to take that and help refine the concepts that we put together here. And our plan for a while now has been to try to submit the application at the end of July. And then you can see it's naturally going to take a bit for the city to review it, and we expect to be back in front of you sometime in 2024. And that's the process.
Great, so we're happy to take questions.
The last time that y'all came and presented this before us, there was talk on the western side of the park district around live-work units, and I see that that's not at all included in this recent proposal.
I don't think they're off the table if that's what we'd like to do. I think they've been challenging. When people go back and look at whether people are working and living in their work-live units, they tend not to be. But I think we have an open mind about that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay.
I have lots of questions. I think it looks beautiful. I think all of that very compelling. And certainly there is a need for housing. I guess part of me, I'm trying to envision, all looks great here, is there a gap between the vision and what the reality might end up being? I guess as a threshold, this would be 1,500 units, living units? What is the current, with Old Baker Heights, how many units were in that? Well, I guess what's the difference between what existed there before?
244 existing units.
How many?
244.
Okay.
There's 244 units of public housing on the parcel.
And-
The actual zoning, and the particular lot configuration that currently exists probably could be redeveloped to something that's about 400, 450
Yeah.
units, I think is roughly ballpark.
That's right.
Without the PDO?
Without the PDU.
So the PDO the reason you need that was going to be one of my questions, is because you need to be able to have changes that would allow there to be essentially another 1,000-unit capacity?
I think there's a couple main features of that. One of them is use. Prior or existing zoning and prior zoning only allowed the residential use. I think the second one is that the street configuration setbacks and other conditions don't allow for scaled housing or any efficiency. And then, you also end up just trying to answer the problem set of what does this problem, and we discussed this last time we were in here, what exactly is the test fit for what is the total development capacity of the parcel, just using our imaginations and taking that imagination and applying it to rigor and seeing what's available, matching that one to what is our own mission and our own strategic plan for the development of housing, and then matching that to feasibility on this site, what amount of this site could carry the housing. And then I think a real driving component is the social connection aspect of this site. How do you basically configure the site in such a way that, A, we provide the housing that's desperately needed, accessibility for all sorts of people at various income levels to access the city and thrive in the city, and then secondarily, how do you socially engage that site so people aren't just trapped in units, but they have nothing at grade to socially engage with each other in? And so our solution to this has been to be very active with civic partners, developing a partnership with KSCR, developing hopefully a prospective partnership with the public library, working with childcare providers, early education providers, and others to really provide the civic core that can ground and anchor the space in a way that also will attract the retail, so the retail will have a functional environment in which to operate with enough traffic, foot traffic, as well as vehicular traffic, as well as just a real amenity, one for the mothers who will bringing their children to childcare and daycare and will be wanting to spend time in those locations before and after, and also really for the rest of the environment. One thing I'd like to note to everyone is within this community is a very large population of our clients of the Housing Authority who have for a very long time lacked any resources, and especially those of disabilities. They've lacked any ability to kind of access a large scale of amenities. And this also helps solve some of these deficiencies that the community has been able to provide up to date in terms of providing amenities and also abilities to volunteer and abilities just to participate in the social environment as an equal. And so I would say there's a whole load of factors, but I think those kind of encapsulate the major ones.
And I guess one other question, I saw the pictures, the one thing that comes up all the time on the commission is parking. Where do the cars go on this property?
The cars go underground.
Okay, are there garages?
They are, and we have multiple parking professionals. So we've been working with the city on that, looking at what's required and looking at some of the ways that you can reduce parking if you can. I think the other thing is that this will be built in phases, and I think we will be building the amount of parking you need for that phase with each phase, and it'll be something that we can look at too as it matures and people use it. But the parking will be underground. We've got the hill so that there's layers coming in underneath there, and you'll be sneaking in off the roads mostly that go up the hill.
And I guess, I mean, this project looks so cool, and again, it's so needed, something like this. I guess what just kind of concerns me, and I'll just get this out there for maybe be addressed at some point, is that it just does seem like this island in this kind of I don't want to say obscure, but a part of Everett that has not really been targeted previously for growth. And I guess I'm just concerned about the viability of, are people going to come to this? Is there going to be enough vibrancy generated because of its location out to draw people and to really to support some of these community resources and this retail that just seems a little bit out of place in my mind for that area, unfortunately, because I don't want it to be, but I can't, that's a nagging suspicion I have.
Yeah, here's my response to that. Early adopters always look like islands. And, you can see that. I mean, I was born and raised here, so I've seen a ton of change. And, I know there's parts of a town you look at and go, wow, that's really weird, that thing there. And then, a couple of years later, you drive by and, whoa, it's a whole new neighborhood. That doesn't happen everywhere, but in our region of boom, it happens. The other thing is that we want to be a model. And, if you look around at what's been happening in COVID, the neighborhoods that have really thrived are the ones that had residential and those amenities. And I think people are hungry for that. People are tired of schlepping their kid around in the car everywhere you go. I raised 3 of them, I couldn't wait to sell the minivan. So I think people actually are hungry. There's certainly enough single-family building in Everett to have people that want that choice to be able to live there. But I think there isn't a choice right now for this. And because it is a model, it's going to be a little bit unique. What we want to do is have those buffers, have that greenery at the edges, have that invitation out to 12 so people know that they can come in here so it's not like some weird gated community, but really to reach out, to invite people into childcare, to come have coffee, come be in the park, come to the, the concert there. So, it's never going to be, things in change always have that kind of fear quotient, but we got to move ahead, regionally, and we want to do it well. And we've got a team of people that have really been doing some of the forefront work on it, and that's our hope.
And I guess, I don't want to take too much time, but one other comment then, as I guess, parking-wise, I guess there would have to be ample parking, not only for the residents, but for hopefully some draw for the rest of the people to come.
And we're looking at the commercial need as well, and where some of those things can happen at different times of day. There's on-street parking. So I think we're definitely paying attention to that.
And I guess the only other aspect of that, somewhat related, would be, I don't know if this area, how well served by transit this area is now, and then also accessibility from Broadway and from the other parts of the city about getting there in the first place, the roadways, arterial, that kind of access. I guess I'm maybe unclear or a little concerned about that aspect.
There's a bus route that goes through there. It's not the one that goes the most often. You can get up to Broadway, or you can go east also to the route on Marine Drive. The transit center's up. It's really not that far to get to the community college and to the transit center. I think those of us who went on the walk really realized how close it is. So, and transit's, getting better and better. And I think when there are more people here, there will be more demand, which, will allow more transit to happen.
This is in the same vein as Commissioner Yanusek's question about parking, and that's introducing this many units into in this fairly high-density configuration into an area that's been historically a largely lower-density residential area served by local streets, is that you're going to be introducing a significant auto impact into the neighborhood. And I got to believe that one of those many logos that we saw there is your transportation expert.
Yes.
And I would just encourage you that when you come back here with your plan, and probably when you go to the neighborhood too, if you haven't already done this, that you be prepared to really talk in depth about what mitigation measures you're introducing to address that auto impact on this area.
Yeah, absolutely. Marnie Heffron of Heffron Transportation is our transportation expert, and she's worked with City of Everett. They have a lot of confidence in her, as we do. And we will be going through an environmental process that will look at all of that with a whole bunch of numbers and models. So we're on that. Yeah.
Good.
I just wanted to thank you. Is it appropriate to clap? Because I think this was a tremendous amount of work, and it was so well presented this evening. Just thank you very much for bringing this to us. You know, the first time that it was presented to us, we asked for more data. I want to see more graphs, more compelling evidence that we can make this a reality. And I've seen that tonight. I'm really excited by the refined level of design, but I'm also excited by the content. I think that both have really stepped up since the last time we saw this project. So I'm excited to see where it goes next. I would also say that my instinct about this project is not to label it as an island so much as an anchor. It seems like something that could really be, it could provide such a firm foundation for what we want Everett to become. And I think that it has the potential to be that and be things that we can't even anticipate yet. But I think that the elements that I needed to see there are there now. And I know that if this is the trajectory that we're on, that it will continue to become just better and better. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for that anchor. I like that.
Yeah, thanks for those words. Very nice.
Commissioner Lark, did you want to add something?
I mean, so many things. There were, a lot of them were, I mean, so elegantly encapsulated by Commissioner McGinn's statement that this is an anchor. So the reason why maybe we don't want to lose you, but.
I'll just be sitting over there now.
Oh, fantastic. This is the first time I'm going to take a look. I've had the opportunity to see the renderings, and this is absolutely spectacularly beautiful. This is a model. This is the anchor. This is what we can do. This is what we can be. And it's more than what we are now. We're a great city, but this allows us to be more. And that's what I'm very excited about. Because, Yeah, and the childcare, like honestly, moving away, I would have to push back. I understand the concern around the auto impact, but if we plan for autos, we get autos, and the car does not serve us well anymore. Doesn't do the job. Like this morning, I missed half my day at work because I was schlepping like my family around. Like my wife grew up in Seoul. She doesn't drive. She says everyone here drives like maniacs, and that's coming from a person who grew up driving around and like living in Seoul. And I don't know if you've driven there. It's a 25 million person city, so it's an intense driving experience. The quality of life that the car gives us is just not what it used to be. And I really would encourage that, yes, we need to plan for it, but we don't need to set it in stone. I like walking places with my son. This gives me and Sam a place to go other than the waterfront, which is nice. The only concern we have is getting across Broadway, easily fixed with a bit of traffic calming and maybe a wider crosswalk. But we'll walk there all the time. That guy, you can't even keep him indoors. Like when it's raining outside, this little toddler will like, you know what, let's go for a 2-mile walk. This sounds like a good idea. This is a place for us to go, a place for him to walk upstairs, to climb around, to be a kid. And we need more of that space here. And, a place where he can go to a library, where we can, and if there's childcare there, one of the best things with the neighborhood I lived in Seoul was that childcare was a 15-minute walk. And my work was another 20-minute walk away. That was it. My life was within a 30-minute walk, and I had everything I needed. This is right next to a major medical center, a children's hospital, a community college, multiple grocery stores, the Triangle Grocery Market, which is delicious ice cream. If you've not been there, I highly recommend. And it's not, I don't think it is an anchor, but I don't think it's an island. You have Providence within like less than a half-mile away. You have Everett Community College, which is less than a half-mile away. You have an 8-story building to the south of it. It's not a single-family neighborhood. It's got multi-story buildings all through it. If you've ever, I've walked literally almost every street in Everett, and this place is prime for that. So, and the fact that there are buffers on any like around 3 corners of it that are already developed, it just makes an absolutely common sense no-brainer to me that this is the perfect spot for it because we already own it too.
Yeah.
Remarks complete.
I think we know that, I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
Improvements to our connectivity are coming down the pipe. We know that improvements to bike infrastructure is coming. We know improvements to mass transit is coming. We know improvements to even just the walkability of our streets is coming with improved sidewalks. So I don't see that as being an issue either. I think that this already feels like it has all the potential to be very connected, and then this will just give our city more reason to make it happen. But
Well, my first thought was, can you guys come do Silver Lake next? Because that's my neighborhood, which already has a lot of potential and a lot of great things. But, and I do think like around just the neighborhood engagement, I can't speak for the Delta Neighborhood Association group, but I would imagine they would really enjoy this because I'm part of the planning or the city groups anyways. This would be really rad for them. The only questions I kind of had was, were there thoughts around, so specifically around the parks? Because you just kind of touched on it about the design and the like where it'll go, but playgrounds in particular, and then the restrooms in relationship to the playground. Because if you bring your kids, you need to be able to change their diapers somewhere. So I just didn't know if that was part of your scope or not.
That's a great question. I don't know specifically where there'll be bathrooms. Given that we are intending to have KSCR be a community space, hopefully, people need bathrooms. In terms of kid spaces, the childcare areas, we've got some targeted spaces that we think would be really good spots for the kids, plus the connection across to other parks. And the other spot that we liked was where the park comes down the hill and crosses Hemlock.
Maybe show.
Oh, sure.
Just go back.
Good idea. Yeah, maybe on the zoomed in one. Oh, just so much. Oh, this is gonna, yeah, the area where you kind of land here. So this is the plaza where KSCR would have a concert. So it's hardscape next to the grass. This is all the stuff and hopefully maybe some beer and coffee and whatnot. So this seemed like a good spot over here to have the kid play area. So you can hang out here and watch the playground from there. But all of that's still, not nailed down.
Well, just keep it at the top of the list. That's my plug for the playground.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So I'm not an architect, I think that's broadly known, but the thing that keeps coming back to me is you've got an impressive group of professionals that you're working with and has spent several $1 million getting to this point. Is this considered best practice, not only for urban design, but also for affordable housing? It feels forced to me, but I recognize that this isn't my subject matter. And so I'm wondering, are we going to look like this was a great idea in 30 years? Or is this going to be considered what not to do in 30 years?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what it'll be like in 30 years, but I think that so much of the housing that's provided in the region, we look to the market to build, and the market has usually smaller sites, and it doesn't necessarily bring the amenities together with the housing. So you end up with a bunch of housing rather than a neighborhood. And that's for reasons that I'm sure really, really heartfelt reasons. But I think the beauty of Everett Housing Authority as an organization is different than the market developer. And so they can do something that is more of a neighborhood-based thing. So I think that is not only best practices, but a really exciting opportunity, because we can build more than just the housing. And I think, like I was saying before with COVID, it's been really interesting to see which neighborhoods have flourished and which have had more problems. And I think, we had zoning for years that, and in this neighborhood, the reason that it doesn't have the place where the dad can take his kid is because you can't have retail uses in the residential.
But I don't hear those complaints from other neighborhoods. I don't hear those comments from the Northwest neighborhood.
Well, the Delta neighborhood said they would like some retail to come to walk to. So embracing the mixed use is best practice.
Sure. I guess what my threshold question is the use of the land in this configuration with the streets planned where they are and the building masses where they are. Would that be considered best practice for this fabric of the city?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I've compared this in my mind to a lot of other sites of similar scale. There's Yesler Terrace in Seattle, which is a similar size and scope, very unusual, but similar legacy building stock. There's a lot of sites we worked with in Redmond, Woodinville, East Bellevue, and those areas that are really auto-centric, where you are taking over a used car lot or something that has no existing sort of walkability component to it at all. I think what is really striking to me is just how walkable the context is already, and being able to take that and riff off it and create these development paths that I feel like are very compact and walkable. I think that's unusual and actually a really great way, because we're usually sort of dealt a hand of cards that is really challenging. You're in an exurban area like in Redmond or Woodinville or what have you, where there's really no city grid, or there's really none of this other existing uses like the school or any of these parks around. So I think there's a really great starting point, and I think the real value that the team has added is simply this 4-block solution with a park in the center. That is something that you don't really see a lot in the scale of development, where you have something that can tap in to the context in that way. So I think it's, as Leslie mentioned, the market delivers housing. So I think what we've done here is just give them a really great sort of point of origin to develop these paths and take them down and make a really favorable outcome.
I mean, I think the market delivers housing in locations where it's permissible or could be permissible, and where the developers think the absorption will occur. So they need to lease those units up, right, or sell them. Yeah. So my guess is that they've got different kind of driving forces than what's at play here. When we last met, we talked about interest in ownership opportunities, and I didn't hear any discussion about that this evening.
Yeah, do you want to take that one?
So we have taken a look at that. We don't really have a whole lot of home ownership opportunities to present. I think taking a look at the site plan and taking a look at the urban morphology, you end up with a few options. One of the options is condominium structures. That is not a place the Housing Authority is positioned to place itself, both in terms of risk, as well as just concern about current legislation. And that is not something that we have been advised by our legal counsel or other advisors to consider, and so we haven't really pushed that concept further. There are a few townhomes on the green buffer to the south for which we could consider ownership, but once again, the Housing Authority is really largely focused on renters and those who need access to housing under low income and moderate income situations, and considering the volume of housing that's available on that site and that would be available to that type of ownership. At the present moment, we haven't really determined that to be highest and best use of the particular property.
Is the resident composition, is it anticipated to be mixed income, or is it anticipated including market rate, or is it, what is the composition? What's the target composition?
I don't think there's a defined demographic. Mixed income would be a good way to describe it, or crossing the income spectrum. We have always, through conversation with the City of Everett, as well as with the Delta Neighborhood Association, committed to ultimately a reduction in the affordable housing that we would naturally provide as a housing authority to 139 units, and those 139 units, for those who have been through several of these conversations, is the difference between the 105 units of affordable housing that's being finished up right now that will be completed at the end of this month or early next month, and the 244 of the original public housing minus 105 gets you to 139 units of subsidized housing. And so our commitment to the community, to the city, and to you all has been we will keep our word on that particular commitment. And so that leaves the remainder of the 1,500 minus 139 somewhere outside the subsidized spectrum and somewhere in, depending on the terminology used, essential housing, workforce housing, up to something closer to market, but preferably not market from a housing authority perspective.
I see. I think I see. That was a long answer. So will there be a unrestricted income component to this housing?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know what percentage that will be?
No.
Okay. What is the anticipated cost per unit for this development?
Don't know, but I think right now, based on cost structures we're receiving for similar yet different projects, roughly around $550,000 a unit is roughly our cost structure at the moment.
And
But
that
as
does-
you know, the market volatility is changing those cost structures very quickly. And I would like to point out, you know, there's upfront capital cost, and then there's long-term ownership. We're a long-term owner. We also are tax exempt, and so our cost structure really benefits long holds as opposed to short-term merchant build type holds.
Understood. So I can put that figure in my own mind. The roughly $550,000 a unit, does that include hard, soft, and land costs?
Yes,
Okay.
we own the land.
No, but, okay, all right.
So we end up with hard and soft costs as the number that would get you roughly to that number.
Okay, all right. I noticed in some of the renderings, which are quite nice, there aren't many showing the taller buildings, with the exception of slide 31, and those aren't rendered. I'm just seeing some fogged buildings there. I mean, these are great pictures, and they're designed to tell a specific story. When you come back, I would love to see some perspectives that show the true scale of those buildings, including the shadows they cast. I think I saw it, well, there we go, right there. Yeah, that's what, 12:15 PM, right? So I'd like to see the shadows that were actually cast. You know, there's been some talk about parking, and again, I mean, this is not my field of expertise, but it strikes me that that some on the lower end of the income spectrum have less flexibility as it relates to timing and getting places and the needs on them as a family. And so I would anticipate that and I'm sure that your transportation expert knows this, but I anticipate that the need for parking is still very, very important to this project. We can't expect people to take transit everywhere. Doesn't always fit into their schedules. Their children get sick. All of these things happen. So I think just recognizing that not everyone has the luxury of Uber or transit. They need that car.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're working multiple jobs, right? So we need that flexibility built in. There was some discussion about the retail core was the terminology used in this. I mean, this is a residential neighborhood. I'm assuming that these are heavily subsidized retail units. I think that the childcare makes a ton of sense. And I appreciate the comment about KEXP. That's a fantastic space. That is in a wholly different urban environment, though, than this is. Completely different. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. And I do think it could be an amenity for the community, but obviously there was no discussion of a grocery store this round, and there was last time. That's
Yeah.
probably been driven to ground that that's not feasible financially.
Well, it's not off the table. The market provider that we were hoping to lure is not so interested. But I think, you know, neighborhood retail stores, the markets are things that people really want. I think there's fewer kind of moms and pops that are interested in running those than there maybe used to be. But we would love to see a market here, and I think we'll continue those discussions.
A smaller square footage than the last time you've seen it.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see a shuttle that was very convenient that went to Safeway. That
Yeah.
would be a lower CapEx way to provide that service, and Safeway might be more safe.
Yeah, it might be a lot easier than having one there. Yeah, with this many units, there's things like that you can do, that you can actually support a shuttle service.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of these will play out over time.
The buildings that I'm seeing in these renderings they appear roughly 6 to 7 stories for the most part. And I heard in the presentation that the taller buildings were anticipated to max out at 12 stories, is that correct? So on a cost per unit basis, I would anticipate that your average cost per unit would go down as those buildings got shorter. As we've learned here in the Planning Commission, we've had some consultants come in. Market rate developers can't afford to build that level of construction. They max out around 8 stories. And so I'm wondering if they can't afford it with full price rents, would it help this project financially? Or said in another way, could you afford to build more units by not going up as high?
We've looked at that. We've looked at what you're referring to is that the cheapest way to build is to stick build over
Over a concrete podium.
Yeah.
Yep.
And there's a limit to how high you can build with that. So that's the cheapest way to build. That's why you see, when you look around, that's pretty much what you see. But one of the things that we're hoping to do is to do some heavy timber construction, which is a little bit of a different animal than, going to the towers you see in Belfort.
Sure.
Do you want to give you that one?
Yeah, there's, I guess, first of all, 12 stories is, as you mentioned, a different, construction type than, the more, the sort of 5/2 products. So Leslie mentioned crystal ball earlier, and I think this is sort of a crystal ball question. There is, I think, zones that I can recall working on where, we have done, say, cold form steel frame to get to 8 to 10 stories or 10 to 12 stories even. And so mass timber, which the state just adopted a family of, or a suite of type 4 provisions just this last year, would allow mass timber and CLT and other sort of mass timber type products like DLT to be used in sort of a tower setting. And I think that does open it up to a more of an innovation sort of component to this that might bring in a vertical developer that is enticed to do that. So that would be a really great narrative or a really great thread to pull on this, that, with the Darrington plant nearby and, having Snohomish wood fiber go into creating dense urban towers, I think would just be a really cool thing. But yeah, I mean, there's a whole spectrum of possible answers to what you brought up. But again, we don't have a crystal ball. All that is driven by the market usually. But there's also other players that come in from time to time. And I think when you're in the realm of mass timber, there is a lot of that sort of dynamism in the development community. So anyway, but no way to predict or to guarantee anything like that.
Okay, interesting. I'm thinking about, a potential resident. What do you think that the families with children versus non-families or non-childbearing families will be in?
Yeah, I'm going to let Jason take that too in terms of what they're seeing in terms of the demand.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I think the question is just about what is the forecast of a particular demographic.
Yeah, I mean, where I'm going with this is I'm trying to, I guess the question is, if I don't have a family, would I rather live downtown in the Nimbus or would I rather live here? And I don't actually know the answer to that question, but I think it's an interesting question because we've got market rate projects that have recently come online that are in the works. We're seeing, buildings under demolition and sites being raised and prepared for development now in and around the Metro Everett area. And then we've got this. And so if I'm shopping for housing, and if I wasn't constrained to having to go here, where would I choose to go? And I think it's an interesting question. I probably would personally choose to go downtown in Metro Everett where the amenities already are. And the more of me that think like that, the more amenities that will be in downtown Everett.
I think the only thing I can offer to that, which is certainly a valid question and one I don't think any of us are here very well placed to answer, is that, one way to look at that is whether or not we live in a world of scarcity and whether your question about folks' options for housing and the demand for that housing is a world of scarcity or a world that lacks basically a scarcity issue. I mean, my way of thinking about this and experiencing this from my seat at the Housing Authority is that we live in a world and we live in a city, and we live in a city with very broad forecasts coming out of the county as well as the city of very, very deep scarcity of what we would call severe scarcity. And I think if you use that as your intellectual paradigm and foundation for coming to a way to answer that question, I think my answer to that question using that framework would be absolutely right. Some people would prefer to live downtown. Absolutely, some people would prefer to live in the waterfront area. Some other people would prefer not to live in either one of those areas for a whole wide variety of reasons, and would probably have a preference to live in North Delta for services, for just personal preference, for identity with a group of people as a community. I think there's a whole wide variety of reasons why you choose one place over the other. And I don't necessarily think in this particular environment, it's a pure competition between downtown retail core versus what's being proposed here as an alternate universe. I look at it more as adding pieces to the whole for a bigger pie.
Yeah, and I agree with that to a large extent. You guys are, I mean, there's a full head of steam here. You guys are like well into this. A lot of money been spent. A lot of smart people have been thinking about this. I guess, given where you are in the process and the likelihood for your success, given how much energy is behind your effort, I would say that the responsibility now will be to make sure that this doesn't become an island, an economic island, that provides for opportunities for economic integration, upward mobility. And I think that by isolating this neighborhood, if it does go that direction, that's a disservice to the people that you're trying to serve so well.
I would agree with you. I think we all have that responsibility. I think we certainly take that responsibility very seriously, both as individuals, as practitioners. From the Everett Housing Authority's perspective, that's something we think about every day, both in service to our clients, but also future clients and residents. But I would also point out it's also a citywide, countywide. The scale expands in terms of the responsibilities that are needed to be placed to bear to allow these things to happen in fruition. And so I certainly take all of your points and appreciate the really hard questioning, because I think that makes us better. But I also think that we're up for the task and we're motivated for the task, and we're positioned pretty well to take advantage of the winds behind us as we move forward to kind of solve these housing problems and also just social connectivity in general. So thank you very much, Commissioner Finch.
Yeah, and I hope this project is, you know, a huge success. Like I said, you've got a head of steam, so I don't think there's any slowing this down, but I do want to be having coffee with you in 20 years.
Would love to.
And me telling you I was wrong and this is a great project.
It could possibly go both ways, but let's weight it much more on the right side than the wrong side.
Yeah, thank you.
These things always move. Thanks.
Michael, I had one thought about your question, your rhetorical question, I guess. And it's so interesting to me because I have no background in real estate. My background is in architecture, but I think where we overlap in the Venn diagram of our careers is we could agree that real estate in the residential spectrum is emotional, and it ties in a lot to a sense of place. And I think, you know, I've been subjected to a lot of really traumatizing lectures on failed housing projects as an architecture student, but it never really had anything to do with the architecture as in terms of the style of architecture, or this failed because it was clearly built in the 70s. It was a very bad time architecturally. You know what I mean? It has to do with the sense of community that was or wasn't created. So here, I think, you know, I'm excited by the images just like you were because they're beautiful. And I think that if those things were really built, it would be lovely. But I think what's really exciting here is that reach for community, you know, building a sense of community that could be so necessary in our city, because we do have a downtown and there is a sense of place in our downtown that, you know, is more successful, I think, in some respects than others. But this is different because it really does create something that we don't have yet in Everett, which I think is having community outside of downtown and offering an experience that you can't really get anywhere else. You're close to downtown, you're adjacent to downtown, you have access to those amenities, but you also have like this incredible green space. You know, if that succeeds, that's incredible. And it doesn't really matter what your apartment looks like. And
Yeah, no,
I mean,
I
the
agree
market
with
is
you.
gonna
Yeah.
drive it for sure, but it's that emotion of the place. Somebody, I'm going way back. I'm thinking how it felt to feel single without kids again, and it's hard, but I think as a single gal, I would have looked at this and thought, yeah, I can see myself on that patio with a glass of wine with some girlfriends, enjoying the view of the mountains.
Yeah,
Or,
and-
you know,
until-
going up to my place and enjoying my water view after work.
I hear you, until your lease is up, because it's lonely there, and you want to be downtown, where the action is. One other thing about these renderings, which are beautiful, I'm anticipating that these are actually the contemplated finishes that are included in that $550 a unit figure that was roughly quoted. Because some of these details, even rendered, look expensive. So I'm hoping that that's what we're getting
That's
for
why they're so
$550 a unit.
exciting.
I mean, it really is, I would encourage you not to lie with pictures. And I don't mean that in a negative way, well, I do, but I just, be very honest about what the human experience might be and what those finishes might look like. There's a lot of really nice glazing in these images, which I think is wonderful. But then I look at the buildings that are there today, and they don't look anything like this. So I want to make sure that what you're proposing, what we're seeing, is what we'll see if and when this gets built.
Yeah, I just want to mention that there will be design standards that come along with the PDO. So we're working on those now.
Don't
I
let me
understand
down.
that, but
Yeah.
Don't make
beyond
Michael
threading
right.
that needle, I want to see what you're contemplating,
Yeah.
not what you hope to do, but what you're contemplating.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for all their great words, but I very much just want to continue encouraging you guys to keep on thinking innovatively and thinking differently. I know that this is very different for that neighborhood and very different for us as a city to be contemplating. But I really think that, like, I mean, talking about 30 years in the future, I mean, we might have light rail up to Everett Community College. But, like, seriously, whether it's 30 years, 40 years, hell, 80 years. Once light rail gets up there, and it's clear that the Sound Transit Board does eventually want it to get up to Everett Community College, it probably will need another ballot measure and billions and billions and billions of dollars of additional funding. But I really think that, like, when we look at the future for Everett, that communities and projects like this are very much part of that future. And I very much think that, like, I mean, currently right now, it's really hard to not own a car in Everett and to try to just live your life. And I mean, I think a big factor in why we're not hearing about people not using cars is largely that, yeah, like,
They can't get here.
I mean, when I was like living at Cocoon House, I pledged that, I'm never going to get a car. I don't need a car. I can just take my bike and take a bus everywhere. And eventually those dreams were just crushed. But I really want this to be a city where people don't need cars. And this project, I mean, if you can walk, I mean, it's not a long walk to Broadway, and you could just get on the 7. And there's plenty of grocery stores nearby. There's plenty of other community assets. And especially, like, if you're someone that you just left home at 18, you're looking at, all right, how can I afford to go to college? And, well, there's Everett Community College is available right there. And with the distinct lack of student housing at EVCC, I can very well see students spending their financial aid checks on this place. And I really think that, like, I mean, we're in a housing crisis. We need more solutions like this. And honestly, like, we need to be thinking so big that, like, I want to see stuff like this all over North Everett. Yeah. Like, we fundamentally need to change as a city, and we fundamentally need to resize what we think we are as a city, because I mean, we're out of Kansas. We're no longer there. What existed in the 90s and 2000s is long and dead. And we really need to start thinking about how are we going to absorb so much growth, tens of thousands of housing units. And I just really want to commend you for just putting in this innovative work, and I'm so for this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can't thank Commissioner Atkins for those comments. To be crass, we're not in Kansas anymore. Like, we are competing in a global economy. We are competing against cities that are larger than the state of California for resources, for talent, for opportunity, for innovation. We can barely keep an award-winning coffee shop open past 2 o'clock in this city that's just across the street. We don't have the horsepower. There aren't enough people rowing at the ship to move us ahead. Putting more folks in Everett gives us that horsepower. Giving people affordable housing allows them to spend money in the local economy, to buy amenities, to purchase things to drive this economy forward. It creates opportunity, it creates chances for people to start businesses, and it creates an ecosystem that will drive us forward. And you know, this thing is that anchor, it's that model, it's the tip of the spear, you know, and it may be different at the beginning, but it's something we gotta replicate, because it replicate just not only here, but in other places. And I will say this in full agreement with Commissioner Finch, finding ways to do this in an ownership model, because we got to start building wealth of our citizens as well if we're going to be successful. So we need a lot more folks here rowing the hands at the oars, and we need a lot more places for them to live. And this is a really good first step. So I am grateful for that. And I think I am optimistic. I think it will be as beautiful as rendered, and because it's a beautiful plan, smartly conceived, in the right place, at the right time. And the only thing that is, the only thing I would say is maybe we can go bigger and also go in Silver Lake, right? Silver Lake.
God, it feels like, are you guys running for office anytime soon? I mean, this is the Planning Commission. The question I would have to my fellow commissioners is, would anybody not like this project if it were in the Station District or in downtown?
I would only say my yeah,
sure.
I would
Can we
want
find
it
them
bigger in downtown, because we can go higher. Can we have it on the beaches and in the air? We will fight them, it's just.
Honestly, just everything north of 41st.
So I guess that's you got, again, great presentation. You've done a great job of selling the need and the program. I'm still not sold on the location. I keep coming, I know you own it, I get it, but you know how to buy property. You've bought property elsewhere in the city. I've heard the complaints about, where else can we put 1,500 units? And, you look at the density per acre that, private developers are producing on tight urban sites. I mean, 300 units an acre is not out of the question. In fact, that's what some of these buildings are being built to today. I like the project in a vacuum. I scratch my head about it being an island, an economic island even worse. And so I'll buy the coffee in 20 years if I'm wrong.
Well, maybe we can have coffee sooner. I just wanted to add one thing on the location. I mean, it would be great to have 15 acres in downtown, but it wouldn't be downtown if you had 15 acres there. Although there's some places I think could use some density.
But downtown is bigger than 15 acres. I
Oh,
guess
yeah,
that's my point, right?
Yeah.
So you're talking
Yeah.
about consolidated ownership.
That's correct. But one thing I just wanted to point out on the site that I think is really exciting is that, in these discussions that are being had regionally about where to put density, a lot of times you just like throw somebody on an arterial. And this is not sitting on Broadway. Like you've pointed out, you can walk a couple of blocks and get to the Safeway or to the bus, but you're not breathing the fumes. And so I think a lot of the denser stuff gets put there because people don't complain, So I really think this is a unique spot, and we need more of these unique spots. And I just love the anchor idea, and that's the hope.
Can I add one quick thing? So I think one comment about the island is that if this existed solely and the rest of the environment didn't change through time, over say a 30, 40-year axis as we age together drinking coffees, I think maybe there could be an argument about island versus anchor, but I think if we took this and we're able to, and maybe that's what we should do next time we come back and present, is a conceptual kind of imaginary conception of time over 30 years, what the movement through Delta, through Broadway would be. I think we no longer are talking about a world in which this is sitting by itself as an island. And one way I know that's true is because the Housing Authority owns roughly 10 acres just down the street, which we introduced all of you to, those that were able to join us on the walk, which is just across from Wiggams Park, which is roughly about 3 minutes away by foot, call it 5. At one point that will be redeveloped too, because its housing faces the same obsolescent issues as this housing did. And so we're not really talking about one sole project of 12 acres and nothing else in the community is going to change. We are talking about the Housing Authority taking the initiative to basically use the acreage that we have and the energy that we have and the intellectual leadership we have of the consultants and the team that we have to use this as a model, as a prototype for how we might start this movement towards deeper and more sensitive housing, towards social engagement, and then creating other communities similar to that that create basically a synergy between those communities and the use of facilities such as Wiggams Park, so that we no longer are really talking about islands. We're talking about corridors of humanity between, say, Broadway, if we're talking about Broadway over where our Grandview is, which is basically on the far northwest of Broadway, and running all the way through the corridor, then running through Wiggams Park, then running here to Park District, and then carrying your way over basically to northwest or further south down Delta, depending on what your trajectory is in the community. I just think that there's an argument that's much more expansive than the singular island argument, although I agree conceptually that's a very good question, a challenge for us to solve, but I think there is a solution for it.
And I understand that, and I can understand the vision, and it also makes sense that you have additional acreage in the area. I wonder if that too was the vision when the existing 8-story building that we went up into, if that was the vision at that time, because it hasn't materialized. It's an island currently. I grew up in Northwest Everett, moved into a couple of different houses when I was younger. And that area was always referred to as the projects. And as a kid, you don't realize that there's a negative connotation with that. I do now, of course. And I just don't want that to continue in this neighborhood. And so that's why, when I'm talking about, income diversity of the population, I think that's important. And opportunity for upward mobility. I don't want people to point to this area and say that's the poor district. That's not helpful.
We're fully aligned on that.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Commissioner Sullivan?
I do. So 2 things. You talked about the 8-story building feeling like an island currently, which would eventually, that would no longer be the case.
Sure.
So, perfect. The acre has grown, right? And then the second thing that I keep thinking about is, I think the thing that I like about it is cool. It's really cool. I mean, that's literally I just keep thinking about, this is so cool, this would be so cool. And as silly as that may sound, it's actually very important to feel cool, which means you feel pride in where you live. So that's all my comments go for the very coolness of this.
Commissioner Zelinski?
Madam Chair, I would just remind you that we do have other items on our agenda.
Yeah,
And I would encourage you to move things along.
Commissioner Zelinski, I will try to keep my comments brief, but I really appreciate this discussion. I think Commissioner Finch, I think I understand where you're coming from, because the concentration of poverty in any space is never good. And I think that's an important issue to raise, and it's an important thing to be considered with this project for the health and welfare of the community. But I'll tell you why I'm excited about this, and I'm going to try to keep this short. I remember a couple of decades ago, before Mill Creek Town Center existed, and I remember the low-density housing there off of Everett Highway, and then I remember when they started connecting these different amenities, the retail spaces, the park, the Boys and Girls Club, the childcare, the mixed-income housing. And now when you go through that space on a sunny day, the community is out, folks are walking their dogs, they're walking with their kids, they're visiting restaurants and coffee shops, and I think that is a really wonderful environment. It feels good to be in that environment. And to Commissioner Sullivan's point, and Commissioner McGinn's point, residential real estate is emotional. It matters how you feel about the space that you live in. And folks in the Delta neighborhood have not often had this kind of attention paid to the way their neighborhood feels. And I think that this is a very thoughtful design. I think it is a very thoughtful project. I think it is really trying to respect the needs aesthetically, in terms of just the artistry of the area surrounding that community. I think it is a really wonderful, positive thing. And I have long envied all of those amenities in the Mill Creek Town Center, being in that single space where you can walk. And I have thought over and over, can we just build these here and there and everywhere? I think that this is very ambitious, and I support this project in its most ambitious form. 1,500 units is not enough. Let's do it again. I also had an interesting conversation with a community member recently who is a Snohomish County resident, and while they want housing because we need housing desperately, they're a country girl, and they don't want to see urban sprawl. They don't want to see us pushing further and further out into the rural spaces in this county to accommodate the housing needs of the residents who oftentimes they prefer to be around hubs. They prefer to be around where they work. They don't want to see that. And so I think that this project is a lot of density, but it is thoughtfully done, thoughtfully densified, if that's a term. They also want to see carbon emission reduction, tree canopy preservation. Those types of things are very important to our quality of life, to protecting and preserving our green spaces, and I feel like those elements were considered, deeply considered in this project, and so I appreciate that. It's a little disappointing to hear that ownership opportunities are off the table, because that is something that is very necessary, but sometimes you can't have it all. And this is quite a lot in a pretty compact bundle. Anything further, commissioners? Okay.
Can I make one request? Sorry.
Okay.
I guess I want to ask for maybe in the future some additional information. What I keep kind of coming back to in my mind is the idea of the retail or commercial space here, and I guess I'm not quite clear what the ratio is of that to the housing. But coming back to what Commissioner McGinn talked about, placemaking, making a place, but then also Commissioner Lark's comment about that we can't keep an award-winning coffee shop open downtown. I'd be curious to hear more detail about who are these retailers? Who are these? What businesses are going to be there? Are there actually like going concerns that are interested in these locations? The types of businesses that people will actually be attracted to, that maybe aren't just your mom and pop places that people know, that will maybe come from other neighborhoods to go to, that will actually be sustainable and drive that vibrancy, as opposed to just being these, a small one-off place that nobody's really going to want to go to if you don't live next door. And are they really going to be sustainable businesses that will actually attract and build that place, as opposed to just being, places?
Well, we have 4 advisors on our team. Real Retail, and you'll be happy to know that they were the retail advisors for the project that you like in Mill Creek.
Town Center.
Because we want to make sure that the retail that we're planning for is going to be sustainable. Because, we hate storefronts that are not.
And I guess my other question, I don't need an answer from you. The other
Okay.
thing I'm curious about is just Everett Housing Authority, they provide housing. Is Everett Housing Authority also going to manage the retail and the commercial properties? And is there expertise in your organization to do that? Because I imagine the motives are very different. You're providing housing to low cost, to areas of people who maybe can't afford some of the market rate. There's not driven by that profit motive. If you're operating vibrant commercial spaces, they need to be profit driven, they need to be profitable, need to be reinvested, they need to be managed very differently, I would think. So I guess I'd maybe like to hear kind of more about the thought in that, to make sure that this retail part of this is actually going to be successful and drive that place and make that economic engine and drive this whole machine, because I think that is a key component to the concept. And without that, the concept kind of starts to fall apart. And in my mind, maybe it'd be better to convert some more of that retail space to more housing, which is really what we need. We don't need more failed businesses that just keep turning over and turning over. We have lots of spaces downtown, there's, retail on the bottom, housing above, that are just sitting empty. And I always drive by and say, what a shame. I know why we do that, but what a shame. I don't want to, how do we avoid that here? I guess I'd be curious to hear more specifically about what the plan is to avoid that at this project that we can't avoid in the downtown core. So I don't need the answer.
Thank you, commissioners. And my last comment, I think that the attention paid to deliberately creating spaces of community connectivity, social connectivity, I think that those are so important to the safety of the community. And we have a lot of folks out in the community right now that are particularly concerned about issues of safety on our streets. And so I think that is a necessary element. And with that, I think we have an opportunity for public comment. Do we have anyone in person who'd like to comment on this topic? Mr. Mohammed. Please state your name and try to keep your comments to 3 minutes, please.
Good afternoon, good evening. Amazing presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your feedback. My name is Ishmael Mohammed, 3731 Colby Avenue. I'm a local small developer here in the city of Everett. I didn't come in here to listen to this, but it's very exciting, and this project cannot go wrong, actually. In 30 years, we'll come back and it will not go wrong, because the city is putting in $1 billion into it. So how can it go wrong? $750 million into building this, and $60 million into land. So if we start putting $1 billion in each of these projects, I don't think they're going to go wrong. It comes in when a private developer wants a 4-unit tax exemption. We cannot allow that, but we are putting in $1 billion into this project. So congratulations. I don't think it's going to go wrong. Maintenance would be another issue that we will come across. Why do we have a need for affordable housing on Everett Housing Authority? Because I own some rental properties, and Section 8 vouchers people, they're never entertained. Not never, I would say. I have several of them. I actually prefer them because of a consistent rent coming into the bank account. But when the unit goes on market, it takes 3 days for somebody to come and rent it. But if I entertain a Everett Housing Authority voucher person, it would take probably 2 weeks for some reason. Not some reason. They're valid reasons, Somebody has to come and inspect the place and everything. So there are a lot of need for the Section 8 or the voucher housing. That's why we are creating this housing, because the private entities couldn't provide it because they are entertaining the people who comes first and just rent it out at market rate. With 150 units, 550,000 per unit, do you think a private entity would be able to sustain that? Yes, only Housing Authority can sustain it because they have funding. I don't know where it's coming from. But an apartment complex, an apartment unit for 550,000, that's a lot of money for an apartment unit, We will have a successful project. I have no doubt in there, because we are putting in funds into it. And this is the vision we are going into. Have you looked into a public-private partnership into this? Because as Commissioner Adams said, that how are we going to come up with maintaining those retail spaces? we can hardly pay the market rent for the current rental housing. So consideration would be to go with the public-private partnership.
Mr. Mohammed, if you wouldn't mind concluding your comments.
Sorry?
If you wouldn't mind wrapping up your comments.
Okay.
Thank you.
A composition of, I think rentals would be important, so we don't have all the low-income housing people in the community there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. Kathy, do we have anyone online who'd like to comment? Okay, all right, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Please state your name and city of residence and try to keep your comments to 3 minutes.
I'm Sonia Bodge. I live in the Delta neighborhood in Everett. I'm the vice chair of the Delta Neighborhood Association. I moved to Everett because I wanted to live in a vibrant city. And I love my neighborhood. I love my neighbors. I've gotten to know a lot of the people at Baker View. I helped bring some safety features to the parking and situation there with the traffic engineer last year. And have been kind of vocal with the traffic engineer about access from Baker View, because we see a lot of people with mobility problems going to Safeway. It's not just 2 blocks to Safeway from Baker View or from the Park District. You know, we all have kind of had mixed feelings about it with regard to the height. Thank you for bringing up that the photos don't show the height, the true height of the 12-story towers. That seems to have been a consistent problem with the presentation. That area is very densified with affordable housing already, and definitely there's not enough amenities for people there, mainly for childcare, after-school services. There's a lot of unattended children in our neighborhood. Also, I don't know if any of you remember the Riverview Apartments down the hill by Jackson Park. We were really against some of the features of that, the lack of parking, the sidewalk that went through our park, which has been breached. They have a fence that everybody goes through anyway, and the parking became a debacle. I've been to several meetings that you guys have held, and many of the residents of Baker View brought up the parking issue. One woman was almost in tears. A lot of the older residents brought up the issue of, we don't want to live around a bunch of children. So I hope you're hearing some of the things that a lot of the residents who live in Baker View already, and me as a neighbor in a house live around it, I have the same concerns. We love to go to Colby and go to the restaurants in Hewitt and all these things. I worry too that we can't support some of the retail items there as well. Safeway is, you know, stressed out as it is with issues, and I worry that maybe it might not remain if the safety issues go away there. So then you think, well, we need a grocery store in the new housing area. There's a lot of great things I think about it. I do too want to see more, where is this retail coming from? I hear KSER all the time, and I don't hear any other businesses being brought up. I'd like to see more of that, and anyway, this was kind of my general comments. I wasn't really expecting to speak today, but I look forward to it, but I also agree that it could be something that's there for 10 years before anything else comes along, and if there's empty places, it's just going to be mayhem. So anyway, there you go. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for your comments. Does that conclude our public comment on this? Okay.
Can we go again? I'm just kidding.
Thank you for that presentation. Thank you for the information and for allowing this discussion to happen in front of the community. I think it was very important for the community to hear both the concerns as well as your responses to those. Thank you. So we will now move on to item 4B, Everett 2044 Growth Alternative Briefing, continued. So Becky, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this late hour, I will try to go through this relatively quickly. It is a lot of things that we've been talking about, and so I'm just building on some of those concepts here. The idea of this, when we get to it, is that we will come back to you at your meeting in June and sort of get yes, we think this is the right alternatives that we need to move forward with. So, just a reminder of why we're doing this, statutory requirement, extending our planning period, there's new state laws, we have new multi-county planning policies, regional growth strategy, countywide planning policies, we're engaging with the public again, and of course our environmental review. So we moved the needle just a little bit, and today we're going to be talking, I'm going to share with you the key questions that we'll be asking the community on this phase of the project. We've refined those growth geographies, so we have some new maps to show you. We did talk a little bit about the housing types, I think, last time, but we want to incorporate those, look at the new maps, and then talk about next steps. So what we're really doing is we went out in our first phase and we asked the community about what would you like to see? How would you like to see the city grow? Get comments about the things they like about the community. And so what we've done now is incorporated, as well as talk with you and the council, incorporated those comments and then our best judgment on creating the alternatives, 3 alternatives. So we're just going back to get a confirmation. Are these the right ones to study? We're doing this before we launch into our environmental work because that's pretty significant work. Then if not, then what changes should we do before we proceed? So those are the main questions we'll be asking the community and, of course, Planning Commission and Council. So we prepared a map. This is just the growth geographies. We've talked about them before, but it's those urban corridor frontages in your report. It really, it gives you the names of what those are, but those are the dark green. Then around those are the urban corridor frontage frames, or what we can call transition areas. Also Metro Everett, and looking around the periphery of Metro Everett, is there any opportunity to extend a frame in that area? We're going to acknowledge the light rail stations since they are expected to be here by 2041 during this planning period. We're also taking a look at those east-west connectors, and is there an opportunity, because they are good-sized roads, to add some growth in those areas. And then, of course, all of our residential neighborhoods, special areas, which we'll talk about, and then our employment areas. Did you have a question?
On the east-west connectors, can you
Yes.
point out where those are, what streets those are?
Yeah, so those are the blue. So Madison, I guess I went right to the center. I could have started one side or the other. 19th, there wasn't any point to going into Metro Everett. It has its own.
Sure.
And so the next street that really met the criteria there is Madison. Then Casino Road, there wasn't an opportunity on the west side, but outside of the radius of the light rail station, there's some opportunity to look at the growth in that area. Then there's 100th, very small area there, and 112th, which is down by Silver Lake.
And maybe this was considered, but it strikes me that there are some cross streets that maybe aren't connectors, but are sufficiently dense where they become, potential nodes. I'm thinking of, Claremont area, for example. There's enough density there, enough services. The, configuration of the street grid is such that it seems like those nodes could be densified in a sustainable way.
Okay. Next slide. Here's the list again. I won't go through all of those. These again are the housing typologies. So these are how we're identifying the intensity of the housing type. So you will see that I'm focusing primarily on housing because employment is a little bit different. We're not suggesting expanding any employment areas that aren't already existing. So we have our single-family residential, the neighborhood residential, which we really refer to as our middle housing, the low-rise, somewhere in between there, the mid-rise, apartments 4 to 6 floors, and then of course the high-rise is 7 or more floors. So you'll see that really the mid-rise and the high-rise are also our mixed-use zones. So it's not just housing, but it includes commercial activity as well. So we started taking a look at, well, where should these different housing types go into which geographies? So I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at
This one is what types of buildings? fit
what types of
which-
buildings fit into each of these categories. So, yeah, that's a good illustration there. Detached, middle housing types, and the mid and high rise. So our growth alternative goals, quickly, again, maximizing the differences so that we can really study the impacts of the types of features that we'll see in the different alternatives. So having this way we can measure, again, what performs well, what doesn't perform well, and we'll likely see some combination in the preferred alternative. It should be reasonably achievable, so we can't just put things on a map just for the sake of putting things on a map. And as I mentioned, we're focusing on the housing growth, and here are the numbers again. So 37,000 new housing units. We have room for about 20 or 21,000 currently, so we've got to find that other increment of 17,000 and another 76,000 new jobs. Okay, so here are the new maps, and I've got them on separate slides. So the existing plans extended, or current plans extended, is an alternative one. So you see the dark is where the most intense developments go. Then sort of that it graduates. The orange is our mid-rise, and then low-rise, and then of course the yellow is the single family. So you could see the pattern there along the arterials. Alternative 2 is, yeah, just go, yeah. This is another way to look at it, which is just showing you in those geographies what the intensity of use is, how it's shown. Alternative 1, housing along those urban corridors again, and in Metro Everett, minor increases to in that reasonable use category since we don't meet our 2035 targets through our capacity analysis. Acknowledgement of the future light rail stations, and that again is about 21,000 new housing units with current plans extended. Alternate 2 concentrates, that takes the similar approach where you're concentrating the growth in the urban corridors. So this would, in the growth areas, would allow for capacity of about 17,000 more housing units along urban corridors in Metro Everett. We would assign some amount of growth we think would be in the light rail stations, although that planning would occur after the comp plan update, sub-area planning. And then using maybe a little more intense in the areas, the transition areas between those corridors and the residential neighborhoods.
Becky, can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
We talked about at the last meeting about how recent changes in legislation was potentially going to impact this planning. When we were talking about alternative 1, does that incorporate already these changes?
No.
Okay, so I
It
guess my
doesn't.
question is, with the new laws, would that plan alternative 1 extend even be possible to be compatible with the new laws?
Well, neither 1 nor 2. However, it still gives us that spread to evaluate impacts of different ways of growth. And so,
Look at it would be, it provides us the perspective, but it's not a realistic alternative.
I mean, technically, it would be because we have 6 months
Because
after
of the
the
timing,
comp
right.
plan's done to
Okay.
change it, but
Got it, okay.
again, we're just using that as a baseline.
And I think that's all exactly right. One other aspect is that when we anticipate looking at the preferred alternative is going to be maybe some mixing and matching of different elements. So with the alternative 2, yes, the single family zoned areas would not be consistent with the new middle housing bill. But this gives us, like you said, the perspective to look at some of the more intense development and capacity downtown and on the arterials, and there may be some of those places that we want to bring into the preferred alternative, recognizing that the single-family aspect as described in this alternative, that aspect is not going to be consistent with the state law.
Yeah, I think I'm done. So alternative 3 really is that middle housing alternative, where the majority of the capacity would be in the middle housing arena. So you can see the darker orange there in the neighborhood residential. Because we already have some, is that my microphone? We already have capacity built in for the high intensity in Metro Everett and along those urban corridors, and we expect that in the light rail station areas as well. And then you will see there is a transition area of low rise, where in alternative 2, it was more of a mid-rise in the transition area. So again, separating the two alternatives for a total of 37,000 new housing units capacity for 2044.
Is there so 2 of the 3 are not legally possible, correct? The third one is this where you'd like to end up?
Well, I think, as Yorick said, there'd be some mixing and matching of the two, because we do have some options with the middle housing, and you'll get to hear about that. So this shows it all.
Is it too late to develop your preferred scenario and use that as one of the alternatives? That seems to be a good use of dollars if that were the case, if it's not too late.
I think what we were anticipating was to do these 3 alternatives to give the bookends, give a couple of different, the alternative 3 was probably going to be the real story about middle housing. This was before the middle housing bill kind of changed the narrative around that. And then alternative 2 was going to be, what if you made downtown Everett, right now we top out at 25 floors, what if it's even more than that? Evergreen Way, 9 floors, 6 floors, depending on the stretch of it. What if that was even taller than that? So it gives 2 different stories to talk about. We don't know yet what the preferred alternative should be. We certainly need your help on that. We're going to need the public's help. We're going to need the city council to make those decisions. These are like conversation starters, and we have a year and a half and a little bit more time than that to come up with a preferred alternative using these conversation starters, using a whole bunch of other considerations from the very local to best practices and all those sorts of things.
Okay, so if we're going to move down a path with 2 alternatives that are not possible, then I guess it would be great if those 2 were designed in such a way that you could tease out the components to get data that was useful to you.
Yes, and I forgot the most important part of that is that we're anticipating developing a preferred alternative along with everybody who's participating in this process, running that alternative through a similar environmental review.
Thank you for raising that issue, Commissioner Finch, because I think we briefly mentioned that at the last meeting, and because we want public input and we want public participation in this process, just as a layperson trying to wrap my mind around this, it feels difficult to say we're presenting 3 alternatives, but 2 of them actually cannot legally be accomplished, and so I don't know if we're too far in to adjust that. And if that's the case, then you can say we're too far in to adjust that. But it feels difficult to ask for input on 3 scenarios, 2 of which are not actually viable anymore.
Yeah.
I think it's too late to adjust that.
Thank you for that clarification.
Next types, outreach. You'll hear, we have an open house tomorrow night at the Evergreen Library. We've got an open house on Saturday at noon at the Everett Station Warehouser Room. If you guys want to come and show up, we would love that. We will present to the City Council next week as well, give them the heads up. We're going to go ahead and do an online open house. We'll see what we get, but for those that just can't get there, maybe that will help. We're going to be at some pop-up events like Sorticulture and the Senior Center Fair tomorrow. We do have in June, open house at the Everett Community College. We're looking forward to that. And then we're going to be back to you after all of that in June and tell you what we learned. That was it, right?
That's it.
Okay.
I think it's on here. We're going to the city council for an update on the comprehensive plan as a whole. Sorry if you just said that.
Yeah.
Want to do a time check. It's 8:30. I think the legislative update can certainly wait, so we can skip right over that one and bring that back to you. A lot of the material is just in your written packet here. Want to make full use of Joe Tovar, and thank you for sitting through. I think that was an entertaining and insightful and informative agenda already so far. How would you like to run the rest of the meeting?
I think we should push the legislative updates. I think that's a smart idea, although I know we are all actually really dying to hear that. But time-wise, I think we need to. Do we have anyone who wishes to offer public comment on the agenda item we just discussed, which is the growth alternatives briefing? Anyone online for that, Kathy? Okay, thank you. Then, yes, I suggest we move on to only the critical business and adjourn for the evening.
Great. By way of introduction, so Joe Tovar is staff to the Department of Commerce right now, helping out with middle housing, technical assistance, and brings a wealth of experience with planning in Washington and specifically with the middle housing work. By way of orientation to this topic, so along the lines of the discussion around the alternative here, I wanted to put this slide up and talk about how middle housing is in a moment of convergence right now. So building on the work that we did with a little bit with rethink zoning in 2019 and 2020, and then with the residential infill measures report and work that was done in 2013. The Housing Action Plan kind of drove us in this direction to have one of the alternatives around middle housing that we're going to study in an environmental review process. We also applied for and secured the middle housing grant to move this conversation forward, and there are some deliverables around that that is kind of forcing the timeline on this aspect of the conversation. And then this middle housing bill, of course, just a couple of weeks ago, landed and provided some clarity as well as some constraints, and I think really added an interesting aspect to this. So Joe is going to help us understand a little bit about the middle housing bill, as well as some good practices, best practices around middle housing that have come out of some work that Commerce was tasked by the legislature to do, along with some consultant support. And then I'll try to come back quickly with a little bit about the other two legs of that stool. Joe, thank you. Right button.
Hello, Joe Tovar with the Department of Commerce here. Happy to share with you some images about legislation. Big picture, high altitude, some detail, and then a bit about middle housing and the work we've been doing with Everett and other cities in the region looking at middle housing possibilities. So these are the two pieces I'm going to touch on. This is the bill signing. The governor signed these three bills and several other bills a week ago Monday, so these now are law. Very controversial, a lot of input, a lot of people had a lot to say about what the bill should or shouldn't say. It went through many different iterations, and here when I say the bill, I'm talking about 1110, the middle housing bill. The two other bills listed here, the accessory dwelling units bill and the streamlining the development permit regulations process bill, touch on parts of what 1110 does talk about. So you really need to look at all three of them together to get an overall sense of what the legislature is asking or requiring cities to do in this regard. So let's see. Okay.
Would you rather?
I can do this. Great. When you read these bills, and there's a lot to them, I don't know how much time you spent trying to work your way through legislative language. It can be pretty dense and chewy. So what I've tried to do here is to summarize for you what I'm calling insights about these bills when you look at them together. Some of this is sort of a new way of thinking about legislation and a new way of thinking about regulating land use. The first one is that all three of these bills mandate reforms to local government development regulations, not the comprehensive plans. Now, your comprehensive plan is a very important thing. You're spending a lot of time on that. You've been hearing the work program that you're going to be coming up on for the next year and a half, working on your comprehensive plan. That's basically a policy document. The legislature has given a lot of direction to cities about what should be in the comprehensive plan. House Bill 1220 from 2 sessions ago talked about a new planning goal to accommodate and plan for housing, not just to encourage it, as well as to, in your comprehensive plan, update your housing element to talk about many things, one of which was moderate density housing, which is basically middle housing. So the bills that we see listed here are all speaking to what you do with your development regulations, not your plans per se. Your regulations are to implement your plan. That's what you say in your plan about priorities and what your future land use map says about where different types or forms might be appropriate. That's part of the conversation, but the bills really speak to regulations. 1110 and 1337 regulate by form and units per acre, not by dwelling units per acre. This is a new way of thinking. For many, many years, people thought, well, we regulate land use by density, units per acre, 12 per acre, 24 to the acre, 36 to the acre. These bills don't talk about units per acre. They talk about units on a lot. They talk about form of middle housing types on a lot. Now, when you put a fourplex on a lot of 10,000 square feet, you can do the math and you can figure out what's the density expressed as units per acre. That's not a mystery, but that's not the primary way these bills say that you should be thinking about regulating middle housing and accessory dwelling units. 1110 provides for timely and predictable outcomes. The key concept here is make it timely, make it predictable, reduce costs, increase certainty for everyone, not just the permit applicant, but for the community where this development is going to occur. So strong bias towards objective design standards. Say specifically what is and is not allowed. Where is there a range of choices to be made, but a menu, basically, of how you might achieve these different form and character objectives as opposed to subjective judgments. Many cities have design review boards, which have hearings on projects, and they are guided by guidelines, which by nature are more conceptual and subjective, which has led to an awful lot of concern by many people, including the legislature, which is why they now have said, design is fine, design is important, design is good, but you need to be doing it in a way that is predictable, that is uniform, that people can rely upon. So the administrative design review is another key piece of 1110. What it says there is, when this design review is done, to apply these objective standards, it should be done by, must be done by administrative personnel. Not a hearing examiner, not a design review board, not a planning commission. It must be administrative, the same way that a building permit is processed administratively, governed by specific objective standards. And finally, 1293 applies to all development, not just to middle housing, not just to accessory dwelling units. And basically the thrust of that one is, it's called permit streamlining. It talks about administrative review. It talks about clear and objective standards. So the key overlap there is the word objective. So it sort of throws some light, additional light I'll talk about in a moment on really how to construe parts of 1110. These two definitions have been around since 1990, and they're really important ones for the public especially to understand. I know the planning commissioners get this, but lots of lay people don't get this. Comprehensive plan is not a regulation. It's a policy document. It establishes priorities, gives direction to be implemented through things like regulations and capital budgets and programs. Development regulations, on the other hand, are controls. They control what can and can't happen with a permit application. They tell an applicant and the adjacent property owners and neighbors to know what specifically can and cannot happen. It's guided by the plan, but it controls what happens on the ground. Now, this is significant because, again, these bills talk about regulations. They don't talk about plans per se. Definitions here include the definition of middle housing, and the key words I popped out here is the middle housing means buildings that are compatible with scale, form, and character with single-family houses. The legislature's interested in doing is saying, well, many of these neighborhoods have detached houses. That's been the form and the pattern for a long time. So to introduce a new form, a duplex, a fourplex, cottage housing, into that context needs to pay attention to that scale, form, and character and attempt with regulations, with standards to make it as compatible as it can be made. So compatibility is important. Things that can be done to make this form, a new type of housing, compatible with these existing patterns is what the focus needs to be on as you consider what your regulations will look like. ADR, Administrative Design Review, again, popped out the key words here. It's to be done with objective design and development standards. You don't want to ask the permit administrator to make a subjective judgment. does he or she like the application or the design? That's not the point. The point is, do they meet the standards that you all have recommended and that the council has adopted that will be applied to all these permits? I mentioned 1293 talks more generally about all development, not just housing, but all development is now supposed to be subjected to design standards that are clear and objective. And the piece of light this throws on 1110 is in 2A and 2B. It says, well, if you're going to do this, you're going to have these standards. They must include one or more ascertainable, meaning knowable, empirically knowable, guideline standards or criteria. So again, not subjective, objective. Don't say should or may, say shall or must. So that's the difference between a standard and a guideline. And all this, also, such standards may not result in the reduction in density, height, bulk, or scale below what generally applies to other developments in that zone. So again, here the legislature is saying, yes, design's important, yes, standards are important, yes, you can control what does and doesn't happen, but you can't do it in such a way as to reduce density, height, scale, things that otherwise would be allowed in that zone for that use. So now there's some new things that have happened with the legislature saying the Department of Commerce has a somewhat different role than it has had in the past. Commerce still is the state's technical support for local governments, people like me talking to you, providing technical assistance, providing grants that have been authorized by the legislature to assist with planning. For example, the middle housing grant that Everett and 26 other cities in the region have received to do some of this work. So that's still part of what Commerce is expected to do. But now the legislature has also given the agency the responsibility in some cases to consider requests by a local government to defer or to delay implementation of some of the pieces of this bill for good cause, for criteria that have yet to be adopted, so that someone may request some dispensation that otherwise they don't want to have to comply with or apply in the near term. There's now a mechanism for them to ask for some dispensation in different pieces of what the bill does require. That's a new role. Doesn't make Commerce a regulatory agency in the sense that, let's say, the Oregon's LCDC is a regulatory agency. So I think the agency still doesn't think of itself as a regulatory agency, but we do have the legislature saying to the department, we need you to do some things working with local governments where adjustments or dispensations are appropriate or deferrals are appropriate to give a mechanism for that to happen, short of just saying flat out, no flexibility, you can't do it. Or go ahead and do it and then get appealed and find out 6 years later, after you wend your way through the appeals process, you can't do that. So at the front end is trying to create, again, the legislature is trying to make this as predictable, as knowable for everybody at the front end as they can, and yet to build in some flexibility, and that's part of the role they're looking to Commerce to play in some of these cases. Also, the agency provides guidance. We have a number of things we provided online. Webinars we're offering for people to show them ways to do some of the things that these laws require. We also are going to be producing a model middle housing ordinance that's due to be ready by the end of this year. And it's something then that we'll make available to local governments to consider. They can adopt their own middle housing ordinance. And I think that would be our preference, that you would look at the statute, you go through your process, you consider the toolkit we'll talk about in a moment, that we'll look at the model middle housing ordinance we come up with by the end of the year, and then do what you want to do that fits best for your city. That might be different than the city next door or down the county. But if you don't, the legislature has said it will default to the model. If you don't do something by the middle of 2025, you will get the model ordinance will preempt, supersede, replace whatever you would have used otherwise. So the strong encouragement is figure out how to do it yourself. But because if you don't, you'll wind up with something that might not be as ideal, fit as well, a model that would apply to others. This is just some language about the model middle housing ordinance. Again, directs the agency to develop this, gives us the deadline, explains that this is the sharpest language I think that's been in the GMA for a long time. Supersede, preempt, and validate. The legislature has not wanted to play I think a heavy-handed role in terms of local government compliance with the Growth Management Act. They've tried as much as possible to make this a bottom-up, local choice kind of process. But here they're saying this is so important. You need to do it. We'd like you to do it your own way. We're giving you time to do it. We'll give you resources to do it. We'll give you some guidance on how to do it. But if you don't do it, then there's a consequence, and this would be the consequence. So now a bit about the grant program. We have 26 cities in the region that took some of the money that was allocated by the legislature to do this work. These graphics up here, just examples of the kinds of posters, products that we're making available to local governments to show them what might these middle housing standards look like. We have a toolkit. We've been working with Opticos Design. This is simply a reference to the funding. The legislature said, here's some money to give us grants to cities to look at this in the interim. So we've had this project going since the middle of last year. It winds up at the end of next month. You see what they were saying here was, these are what we wanted to look at. We want you to look at middle housing, which for purposes of the grant money was duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, most of the kinds of things that now live in 1110 as named in the definition of what is middle housing. We've been working with Opticos Design since last September. We had a workshop just today. These are actually some of the materials we had produced for the workshop today, where we were doing some testing with local government officials, with builders, with architects, to ground truth and look at the emerging standards in the toolkit that they're preparing. How realistic are they? How applicable might they be? What clarifications or adjustment might we make to the toolkit of standards that cities then could choose from if they wanted to incorporate some of these ideas and some of these standards into their own regulations for middle housing. Other things will be available will be a photo library. I think that's already online on our website. Much of this stuff's already on the Commerce website if you want to check it out. The toolkit of potential design development standards is there. Answers to frequently asked questions. After 1110 was adopted, we had a lot of questions from local governments. What does this mean? Can we do this? That we're required to do that. So we're trying to answer that as much as we can. Again, it's the agency's opinion. It's not legally binding. It's not statute. It's not even a whack yet, but it's our best guess at what the legislature wants locals to do and what authority and choices they have under the bill as it was passed. Pro forma tool is a really kind of a cool tool. We kind of test drove it today with the people in the room. It's, how do I describe it? It's basically an economic model developed by subconsultants to Opticos, real estate economists, where you can input into this tool land cost, any applicable fees, impact fees, labor costs, and come up with an estimate of how fiscally viable might a duplex be, or a fourplex be, or a sixplex be in a given sub-market within the region. The part of what they produced is, we call it a place types atlas of different typical places in the region, where they've modeled some of these same factors to come up with different methods of accommodating some of the things that the bill does require. If you did a fourplex, you did a sixplex, what might it look like? The pro forma tool helps you get a handle on how realistic financially might it be for a developer to make this kind of a project work, given these factors. You can also take this tool and you can change the variables, and it'll give you different ideas about what is the price point of a product that might pencil with these factors in play. So it's a really kind of a cool tool. It's not on the website yet, but it will be by the end of June. It'll be publicly accessible, so folks can play around as much as they want to kind of get a sense for what might make more sense in terms of form in a different location even within your city. We'll have slides like the ones I'm showing you now. So some of what I'm going to show you are excerpts of what's in the slide decks. We have videos being produced of all these slides, narrated by Dan Perlick, the author of Missing Middle Housing. So we kind of went to that firm. We had a competitive process for consultants to help us with this work. They won the contract, and they've been working with us, as I said, since last September on all this material. So this is the kind of thing that they've come up with, answering questions like, where can middle housing be added? There's a couple of slides they produced here. One concept is detached, distributed throughout the neighborhood of detached homes, sprinkled in. Could be a duplex, could be a fourplex. Again, there's a lot of room for you to decide exactly where those are and what standards would apply to bulk scale form. Another place where it might be added would be along mixed-use corridors between, let's say, a high-capacity transportation system and a detached neighborhood. Main streets, corner stores, more intense uses might have slightly larger middle housing types than you would find in the middle of a neighborhood of primarily detached houses. So there's a lot of flexibility here into where these things might apply. You have choices you could make, and as I said, there's a lot of standards in the toolkit to pick from. These are different concepts that they talk about, basically regulating building size, not the number of units. So it's, again, not a system of units per acre. It's a matter of how many lots does 1110 tell you must accommodate. Is it 4 per lot? Is it 2 per lot? There's a whole another discussion of accessory dwelling units, which we'll get into in a moment. But again, the concept here is if you can keep the same envelope and chop it up internally into smaller units, you're increasing the opportunity for more households. These are again some key concepts about regulating building width and depth to get a house scale outcome. They made the comment today, the Opticos people who were discussing this with us today were making the point that really, the size of the lot really isn't as important as the width of the lot. They're really talking about what are you presenting to the public realm on the street, how are you accessing it from the public realm. That's really important, really more important than how deep is the lot or how big is the lot overall. Again, 1110 basically says we don't really care how big your lot is. We're not regulating by lot size. We're saying if you have a lot, you need to accommodate a certain number of units on that lot. And how big those units are, how big that envelope is going to be constrained by the size of the lot and things like the setbacks you land on. Parking is a really important issue. Oregon's been through this already. They're going through this in California. People are trying to apply their laws to achieve things like middle housing. And what they're discovering is that a big variable, and is something going to pencil or is it not going to pencil, is how much parking is required. Now, 1110 speaks to this a little bit. It limits the ability of local government to require parking. For example, within a quarter mile, is it a quarter mile? Half mile? It's changing during the session. I think I landed on a half mile. Within a half mile transit, a local government cannot require more than 1 stall per unit. Outside that, you're limited to no more than 2 stalls per unit. Now, that's saying that's, if you want to require less, you may. But they were anticipating that local governments need to be what I'm calling right-sizing the requirement for parking to the form, the number of units, and where it is. So if it's easily accessible to transit, it's walkable to lots of services, there's probably less demand for parking. If it's not close to those kinds of things, that might make more of a case for perhaps more parking. But right-sizing the parking is something they're recommending that local governments do, and there's a lot of guidance, there are a lot of metrics in this toolkit. It's quite a toolkit. I'm just giving you the across the treetops summary of kind of what's in there and character of the kinds of things that it's giving people to think about as guidelines. This is another concept, which is if you've got a lot and it can take more units, you're free to enable more units, capture more households, or allow more households on that lot. This would be an example, for example, if you had a duplex, 2 units in the bottom of the picture here, and you had 2 detached accessory dwelling units, which 1337 requires you to allow in all residentially zoned properties. So you can have a house and an ADU, a house and a DADU. You can have a house and 1 of each. You can have 1 with 2. It depends on the topography. It depends upon the configuration of the lot in question. But what 1110 is saying, what 1337 is saying, you need to be removing barriers to people maximizing the number of households on these lots. People sometimes ask the question, well, are these laws requiring the cities to build these things? No. Is the law requiring the cities to guarantee these things are built by the private sector? The answer is no. What the city's required to do is to make a good faith effort to design a regulatory system that has the least number of barriers to people providing households, subject to process, subject to standards. That might be the last slide. So thank you for listening to all of that. There's a lot more information coming to you online. York's going to be sharing, I'm sure, some of these slideshows and videos with you and others in the coming months that we've produced. And hopefully that'll help you figure out how you might want to go about complying with the law, not just complying with the law, but actually achieving the goals you have for accommodating more growth, more households, and more home ownership. Thank you.
Joe. So I have some follow-up slides, but again, a time check. And definitely if there are some specific questions for Joe, Joe will not be here next month. I will be here next month. We also have an option to have a short meeting 2 weeks from today, that supplemental date, if you would prefer. I can go through my bit in maybe 10 minutes to set the stage. But then that would leave less time for comments and questions. I can hold my bit other than putting this convergence slide on there again. There's even a rule in the bylaws somewhere. I can't remember what time it says. We need your permission there.
Yeah, we're at 9 p.m. Commissioners, are you open to a supplemental meeting on the 30th?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions for Joe before we let him go?
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. I think we have to offer one more opportunity for public comment on the last agenda item. Do we have anyone in the gallery who would like to offer public comment? Anyone online, Kathy? Okay, with that, we are adjourned for the evening. Thank you.